So I brought up gun rights. Gun rights right now are 100% under attack in the United States. We have a president who is senile and just not all right in the head, being controlled by other people, and is basically just going out and spewing the dumbest things he possibly can. And if you thought Trump was bad and you don't think Biden is as bad, you're just not paying attention. So what we're seeing here is Democrats are actively trying to eliminate your gun rights. And anybody who's studied history at all, the first thing anybody who is trying to take control, absolute power, the first thing they do is try to eliminate your ability to defend yourself. So how are Democrats doing that? Well, Joe Biden already did some weak ass executive orders. I'm not worried about those at all, so I'm not even going to go over them. They're largely just symbolic, and they're really not going to do anything. All right, nobody's really going to pay attention to them. They're not a big deal. What Joe Biden is actually doing is there are Democrats in the House and Senate who are introducing legislation so they can pack the Supreme Court. They want to add 4 new Supreme Court justices. Basically what that means is that right now we have 9. And I believe we've had 9 for at least, I want to say at least 50. I know it's at least 50 years. I believe it might be over a century. So I think it might have been since coming out of the Civil War, somewhere around there. I'll have to look back on my history on that one. But he's trying to add 4 new Supreme Court justices. So this is what Democrats do when they lose an election back in 2016 and they can't handle the fact that Trump got lucky enough to be able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. And so now they essentially we have 6 Republican appointees to 3 Democrat appointees. But Chief Justice John Roberts might have well been a Democrat appointee. He votes with them anyway because he's I mean, I've said it before on previous podcasts. If the U.S. has a civil war in this country, I will blame one person and one person above all else, and that will be Chief Justice John Roberts. If we have a second civil war and it goes hot, I will blame Chief Justice John Roberts 100. He's at the top of the list for who to blame, 100%. So they're trying to pack the Supreme Court. So which means that even though nobody resigns from the Supreme Court, even though nobody dies or leaves, whatever the case may be, Joe Biden's just going to get to appoint 4 people to the Supreme Court. And those are lifetime appointments. So now you're saying, well, what does this have to do with gun rights? Well, if you look back at the 2008 decision that finally and rightfully enshrined the private use to own firearms as a personal right of the people, if you look back at that decision, it was decided by a 5-4 majority court. There were 4 Supreme Court justices at the time who said you do not have a right to own a firearm, even though it says specifically in the Constitution that you do. So these are 4 justices also said that abortion is a constitutional right, even though abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution anywhere. So what they're basically trying to do is, those are the 2 situations, those are the 2 issues that Democrats care about the most. They want to take your guns away, and they want to make sure that you can put no limitations on abortion whatsoever. Adding 4 crazy new Supreme Court justices, which is what Joe Biden will appoint, well, he won't appoint them. It'll probably be someone else who decides who's going to be picked, and it'll be some extra crazy people. What will happen is he will appoint justices who will immediately go about overturning the Heller decision, making sure that we can say, oh no, you actually don't have a right to keep and bear arms anymore. So that's the main thing to do. They need to overturn Heller. And then on top of that, what they're going to make sure they do is that for Roe v. Wade, they're going to make sure that Roe v. Wade is expanded. They want to expand it more so that not only is it a constitutional right, but any restrictions on abortion can be challenged in court, or basically they don't exist. So even restrictions that limit your ability to have an abortion after the in the third trimester, when a C-section is actually a better way to go if there's any problems. I mean, that's the safer way to go from my understanding of the science. So, I mean, you have states like New York who have passed legislation saying that a woman can actually decide to have an abortion after her water breaks. So basically 9 months, her water breaks, like, oh, you know what? I don't want to do this. So the state of New York has passed a law that says a woman can abort the baby at that point. That's basically what these 4 new justices will accomplish. They will make sure that laws like that are the only types of laws that you can have when it relates to abortion throughout the country. And that's really what this is about. They lost the 2016 election, which cost them the ability to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. And now they're like, well, what we're going to do is we're just going to add more justices. What they don't understand is that, number one, if you think Republicans are not going to end up back in power, now I know they're trying everything they can do, and this has been something that's been going on for a while. They're trying to add new states, and they want specifically just Democrat states. They want Washington, D.C. to be a state, and they want to make Puerto Rico a state, which will basically give them extra... it'll take House seats away from some red states like Florida and Texas. It'll give them to Puerto Rico and DC. But the main thing is that they will get 4 new senators that will definitely be Democrats. You'll get at least 3 Democrat senators added to the Senate. That's without a doubt. That'll happen. So this is something they're trying to do. These were the 2 things that I was the most concerned about for a Democrat win of the 2020 election, especially the presidency. I was more concerned about the Senate than I was anything else. But the president was kind of like the final backdrop, the final, like, hey, okay, this is not happening. So adding new states and packing the Supreme Court, those are the 2 issues that I was the most concerned about over everything. And it looks like that's going to happen, or at least Democrats are actively trying to do this. This is how they are going to make sure that they come after your guns. Now, I'm telling you this from my experience. I've lived in many different states, and I can tell you right now, if you want a civil war, this is how you get a civil war. You are not going to convince people to give their guns back. The whole idea of a buyback is bullshit. And the people I know in many different areas in this country, they are not going to let you buy their guns back. And if you try to take them by force, you are not going to like the result. And I'll give you an example. I believe it was back in 2013. There was a guy named Cliven Bundy. All right. So he had land where he was having cattle graze, and the federal government said, well, actually, you can't do that anymore. Well, there was a whole court case. Well, there was a whole thing where there was a whole court situation going on, and eventually it got out that, hey, the federal government is not treating this guy fairly. And they're finding him. They're trying to take his life and his livelihood away. They killed some of his livestock, which is his property, which you can kind of compare that to a gun buyback. They just basically confiscated his property, essentially. And so what happened is you had a bunch of people show up with their guns, and they made sure that federal officers were not allowed to arrest Bundy. They made sure that his property was protected. And as it turns out, years later, I believe this went all the way to the Supreme Court, or wherever it went to finally, where it ended, the court decided that Clive Bundy was correct, that he actually was in the right during the whole thing. The government was wrong. So they were trying to ruin this man's life. The Obama administration was anyway. They were trying to ruin this man's life, ruin his livelihood, and they were planning to arrest him and basically remove all ability for him to pay legal fees because he can't make any money anymore because he's in jail. And so they were planning to do all that. And as it turns out, because you had a large group of citizens show up and make the risk of bloodshed so high, that the federal government backed off and said, okay, we'll let the court proceedings go. And eventually it turned out that he was right. So if you think that this is going to be okay on a national scale, when we're talking about one guy who just had some cattle grazing. He got over 100 people to show up with guns to basically tell the FBI, get the fuck out of here. If you think that's going to work on a national scale, that is not going to happen. So I'm saying this correctly. If you think that this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention. And yes, I did quote Ramsay Bolton from Game of Thrones. I know that's not exactly the best thing, but it's absolutely true. This is not a path that you should be rooting for, because this is going to lead to a lot more division, a lot more turmoil in the streets. And if you think that people won't die rather than give up their guns, you are sadly mistaken.